The mountain man named Blake Irwin first saw Fiona Owens on a blistering August afternoon in 1874, when the sun beat down on the dusty streets of Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, with merciless intensity. He had come down from his cabin in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains for supplies, his broad shoulders and powerful frame drawing stares from townsfolk who rarely saw men of his size and evident strength. His dark hair hanging past his collar, his arms thick with muscle from years of wrestling timber and surviving alone in the wilderness. He was loading sacks of flour onto his pack mule when he noticed the young woman across the street, her worn calico dress hanging loose on her thin frame, her auburn hair pinned back in a simple bun, her face beautiful despite the obvious hunger hollowing her cheeks. Fiona stood outside the general store with a small cloth bundle in her hands, and Blake watched as a barefoot child approached her, no more than 6 years old, with dirt-streaked cheeks and eyes that held the desperate look of someone who had not eaten in days. The boy said something Blake could not hear, and without hesitation, Fiona unwrapped her bundle and withdrew what appeared to be the only piece of bread she possessed. She knelt down to the child's level, placed the bread in his small hands, and smiled at him with such genuine warmth that Blake felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced in the 8 years since he had retreated to the mountains after losing his family to cholera. The boy ran off clutching the bread like it was made of gold, and Fiona stood up, brushing dust from her skirts, her hands now empty. Blake saw her sway slightly, steadying herself against the storefront wall, and he understood with sudden clarity that she had just given away her last meal. She pressed a hand to her stomach, took a deep breath, and began walking down the street with her head held high despite her obvious weakness. Blake tied off his mule and followed her at a distance, curious about this woman who would starve herself to feed a stranger's child. She walked past the saloon, past the bank, past the marshal's office, until she reached a small boarding house at the edge of town. She climbed the exterior stairs to the second floor and disappeared into one of the rooms. Blake stood in the street for several minutes, thinking about what he had witnessed, then turned and walked back toward the general store with purpose in his stride. The next morning, Fiona woke to find a wooden crate outside her door. She opened it cautiously, half afraid it was some kind of mistake, and found it filled with provisions: flour, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, coffee, sugar, and a loaf of fresh bread wrapped in cloth. She looked up and down the hallway but saw no one. The boarding house was quiet, most of the other residents already gone to their various jobs and occupations. She carried the crate inside, her heart pounding with confusion and something that might have been hope. Blake watched from across the street, standing in the shadow of the livery stable, and when he saw her pull the crate inside, he allowed himself a small smile before heading back up to his mountain cabin. He had work to do, and it would take him several days to return, but he had already made a decision. This woman with her generous heart would not go hungry again, not if he had anything to say about it. Fiona spent that day cooking a proper meal for the first time in weeks. She had come to Cimarron 6 months earlier, fleeing a bad situation in St. Louis, where her father had tried to force her into marriage with a cruel businessman twice her age. She had worked as a seamstress, but the pay was meager and irregular, and she often went hungry so she could pay her rent and avoid being thrown out onto the street. The mysterious crate of food felt like a miracle, and she ate slowly, savoring every bite, tears streaming down her face as she realized she would survive another week, maybe 2 if she was careful. 3 days later, Blake returned to town with a wagon this time instead of just his mule. He had spent those days hunting and smoking meat, preparing supplies, thinking about the auburn-haired woman and her selfless act. He had been alone for so long, content in his solitude, but something about her had awakened a part of him he thought had died with his wife and infant daughter. He was not sure what he was doing, only that he could not let her suffer when he had the means to help. He found her sitting outside the boarding house in the early evening, mending a shirt by the fading light. She was still thin, but her face had more color than before, and when she looked up at his approach, her green eyes went wide with surprise. Blake was an imposing figure, standing well over 6 feet tall, his chest broad beneath his worn leather vest, his forearms corded with muscle visible below his rolled-up sleeves. He removed his hat respectfully and held it in his large, calloused hands. "Evening, miss," he said, his voice deep and rusty from limited use. "Name is Blake Irwin." Fiona set down her mending and stood up slowly, uncertain. "Good evening, sir. I am Fiona Owens." "I saw what you did the other day," Blake said directly, not one to waste words. "Giving your last bread to that hungry child." Fiona's face flushed with embarrassment and she looked down at her worn shoes. "I did not realize anyone was watching. The boy needed it more than I did." "You were starving yourself," Blake said quietly. "I could see it plain as day." "I have managed well enough," Fiona replied, lifting her chin with dignity despite her circumstances. "I do not need charity if that is what you are offering." Blake respected her pride, understood it even, but he shook his head. "Not charity. I hunt more meat than I can eat before it spoils, grow more vegetables than one man needs. Seems wasteful to let it go to ruin when there are good people who could use it." Fiona studied him carefully. This massive mountain man with kind eyes and a gentle voice despite his intimidating appearance. "Was it you who left the crate?" Blake nodded. "Yes, miss, and I would like to bring more regular-like if you would accept it." "Why?" Fiona asked, genuinely confused. "You do not know me. Why would you do this?" Blake was quiet for a long moment, searching for words. "Because in 8 years of living alone in those mountains, I have forgotten what goodness looks like. Then I saw you give away your last food to a hungry child and I remembered. You reminded me that there is still kindness in this world. Let me help you, please." There was such raw honesty in his words that Fiona felt her defenses crumbling. She had been alone for so long, trusting no one, refusing help because she feared the strings that might be attached. But looking at this man with his sun-weathered face and sincere eyes, she sensed no threat, no expectation, only a simple desire to help. "I cannot pay you," she said softly. "Did not ask you to," Blake replied. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing. Just knowing you are eating regular meals is enough." Fiona felt tears prick her eyes and she blinked them back. "Why are you really doing this, Mr. Irwin?" Blake looked off toward the mountains in the distance, his jaw working as he decided how much to share. "I lost my wife and baby daughter to cholera 8 years ago. Could not save them, though I tried everything I knew. After they died, I left civilization behind, figured I was better off alone. But seeing you help that child, I realized I have been just existing up there, not living. Maybe helping you is my way of finding purpose again. Maybe it is selfish in its own way." The raw pain in his voice touched something deep in Fiona's heart. She understood loss, understood the need to run from it. "I am sorry for your loss," she said quietly. "That must have been unbearable." "It was," Blake admitted. "Still is some days, but life goes on whether we want it to or not." Fiona nodded slowly. "If you truly wish to help, I will accept, but I would like to do something in return. I am a seamstress. I could mend your clothes, make you new shirts. I see yours are quite worn." Blake looked down at his patched shirt and rough trousers. "That is not necessary." "It is to me," Fiona insisted. "I need to feel like I am earning what you are giving me. My pride will not allow me to simply take without giving something back." A smile tugged at the corner of Blake's mouth, the first real smile he had worn in years. "All right, miss. If it makes you feel better, I accept." They stood there in the fading light, and Fiona felt her heart beat faster for reasons she could not quite name. This man was a stranger, yet she felt safer in his presence than she had in months. There was strength in him, yes, but also a gentleness that belied his intimidating size. She found herself wanting to know more about him, to understand what had driven him to the mountains and what had brought him back down. "Would you like to sit?" she asked, gesturing to the steps. "I have coffee if you would like some." Blake hesitated, then nodded. "That sounds good. Been a while since I had coffee with company." Fiona went inside and returned with 2 tin cups filled with steaming coffee. Blake had settled on the steps, his long legs stretched out before him, and she sat beside him, careful to maintain a respectable distance. They sipped their coffee in comfortable silence for a while, watching the street grow quiet as evening deepened into night. "What brought you to Cimarron?" Blake asked eventually. Fiona considered how much to tell him, then decided honesty deserved honesty. "I was running from a bad situation in St. Louis. My father wanted me to marry a man I despised, a man who was cruel and only wanted my father's business connections. I refused, and he became angry. So I left in the night with what little money I had saved and came west." Blake's jaw tightened with anger at the thought of anyone forcing this gentle woman into an unwanted marriage. "That took courage, or foolishness," Fiona said with a rueful smile. "I had no real plan, no family out here, no guarantee of work, but anything seemed better than marrying that man." "Your father, he tried to find you," Fiona shook her head. "I do not think so. I was a disappointment to him always. Too willful, too opinionated. He has 3 sons who give him no trouble. I doubt he misses me much." Blake heard the pain beneath her words and wanted to tell her that any father who would not miss a daughter like her was a fool, but he kept quiet, sensing she would not welcome pity. "What about you?" Fiona asked. "Where are you from originally?" "Kentucky," Blake replied. "Came west with my wife in 1865, after the war ended. We wanted a fresh start, away from all the death and destruction. Settled in Colorado first, then moved to New Mexico when she was expecting our daughter. Thought the warmer climate might be easier on her." "But it did not help," Fiona said softly. "No, cholera does not care about climate." Blake stared into his coffee cup. "They died within 2 days of each other. Sarah, my wife, went first. Our daughter Emma was only 3 months old. She lasted 1 more day after her mother died, and then she was gone too." Fiona reached out instinctively and placed her hand over his where it rested on the step. Blake looked down at her small hand on his large, scarred one, and something warm unfurled in his chest. He had not been touched with such simple compassion in 8 years, and it affected him more than he expected. "I am truly sorry," Fiona said. "No one should have to endure such loss." Blake carefully turned his hand over and gently squeezed her fingers. "Thank you. It means more than you know to hear that." They sat in silence again, but now their hands remained clasped, and neither seemed inclined to break the contact. The night air was cooling, bringing relief from the day's heat, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I should go," Blake said eventually, though he made no move to stand. "It is a long ride back to my cabin." "You are welcome to stay in town if you need," Fiona offered. "The boarding house has rooms." Blake shook his head. "I prefer the mountain. Town makes me feel closed in after being up there so long, but I will be back in a few days with more supplies." "You really do not have to," Fiona started to say, but Blake interrupted her gently. "I want to. Please let me do this." Fiona searched his face in the dim light and saw only sincerity. She nodded slowly. "All right, and I will have a new shirt ready for you when you return." Blake smiled again, and Fiona realized she liked his smile very much. It transformed his rugged features, making him look younger, less burdened. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet with him, and released her hand with obvious reluctance. "Good night, Miss Owens." "Good night, Mr. Irwin, and please call me Fiona." "Only if you call me Blake." "Blake," she repeated, liking the sound of his name on her lips. He settled his hat back on his head, tipped it to her respectfully, and walked toward where his wagon waited. Fiona watched him go, this mysterious mountain man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers. She had not known she was praying. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart beat rapidly, and wondered what she was getting herself into. Blake returned 3 days later with a wagon full of supplies. Smoked venison, fresh vegetables from his mountain garden, more flour and cornmeal, eggs carefully packed in straw, and even a jar of honey he had harvested from wild bees. Fiona met him on the street, her face lighting up in a way that made his heart skip a beat, and he knew he was in trouble. He had told himself he was just helping someone in need, performing a good deed, but the truth was becoming harder to deny. He was drawn to this woman in ways that both excited and terrified him. "You brought enough to feed an army," Fiona said, looking at the wagon's contents with wide eyes. "I got carried away," Blake admitted sheepishly. "Figured you could share with the boarding house owner, help offset your rent." Fiona's eyes softened. "That is very thoughtful. Mrs. Chen will be grateful. She struggles to feed everyone on what we pay her." They carried the supplies up to Fiona's room, and Blake was struck by how small and sparse her living space was. A narrow bed, a single chair, a small table, a trunk for her clothes and her sewing supplies. It was clean and tidy but painfully bare, speaking to the poverty she had been living in. "It is not much," Fiona said, noticing his survey of the room, "but it is mine." "It is honest," Blake said. "Nothing wrong with that." Fiona smiled and reached for a package wrapped in brown paper. "I made this for you." Blake unwrapped it carefully and found a shirt made of sturdy blue cotton, stitched with obvious care and skill. He held it up, marveling at the even seams and strong buttons. "This is fine work." "Try it on," Fiona urged. Blake hesitated, then pulled off his worn shirt, and Fiona caught her breath at the sight of his muscled torso. His chest was broad and powerful, his arms thick with muscle, his stomach flat and hard. Scars marked his skin here and there, telling stories of a hard life, but he was undeniably magnificent. She forced herself to look away, feeling her cheeks heat with embarrassment at her reaction. Blake pulled on the new shirt and it fit perfectly, snug across his shoulders but comfortable. "How did you know my size?" "I am good at estimating," Fiona said, still not quite meeting his eyes. "And I may have asked around town to find out how tall you were." Blake chuckled, a deep rumbling sound that Fiona felt in her bones. "You did your research. I wanted it to fit properly." "It is perfect. Thank you, Fiona." The way he said her name, soft and warm, made her look up at him. Their eyes met and held, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken awareness. Blake took a step toward her, then caught himself and stepped back, running a hand through his long hair. "I should go," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Already?" Fiona could not hide her disappointment. "I have traps to check, firewood to split. Work does not do itself. When will you come back?" Blake heard the hope in her question and felt his resolve weakening. "Few days." "Unless you need something sooner." Fiona wanted to say she needed him to stay, wanted to ask him not to leave, but she had no right to make such demands. "A few days is fine. I will have another shirt ready for you." "You do not have to make me a shirt every time I visit," Blake protested. I want to. It gives me something to do in the evenings besides worry about how I will survive another week. Blake frowned at the reminder of her precarious situation. How is your seamstress work going? You getting enough customers? Fiona sighed. Not as many as I need. The town is small and most women do their own mending. I get the occasional dress to make or repair, but it is not steady income. An idea formed in Blake's mind. What if you had access to more customers? There are ranches and farms outside of town, families with children who need clothes made and mended regular. I know most of the folks in the area. I could spread the word about your skills. Fiona's eyes widened. You would do that. Why not? You are talented. People should know about you. Blake, you are already doing so much. I want to help you become independent, Blake said firmly. Not just survive, but thrive. You deserve that. Tears filled Fiona's eyes and she blinked them back. I do not understand why you care so much. Blake was quiet for a long moment, struggling with his own emotions. Because when I look at you, I see someone worth caring about. Someone who gives without expecting anything in return, who has kindness in her heart despite her own hardships. That is rare, Fiona. You are rare. And maybe I care because for the first time in 8 years, I feel something other than grief when I wake up in the morning. Fiona's breath caught in her throat. Blake. He shook his head. I am not saying this to pressure you or expect anything. I just want you to understand why I keep coming back, why I cannot seem to stay away. Fiona crossed the small room and stood in front of him, having to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. I am glad you keep coming back. These visits have become the brightest part of my days. Blake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her cheek in his large, calloused palm. Fiona leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, and Blake felt his heart constrict. He had not allowed himself to feel anything like this since Sarah's death, had not believed he ever could again. But here was this brave, generous woman, awakening emotions he thought were buried forever. I should go, he whispered, but neither of them moved. I know, Fiona whispered back, but she opened her eyes and looked up at him with such longing that Blake almost forgot every reason why getting involved with her was complicated. He stepped back reluctantly, dropping his hand from her face. I will see you in a few days. Be safe, Blake. Always am. But as Blake rode his wagon out of town and back toward the mountains, he knew he was lying to himself. He was not safe at all, not anymore. He was falling for Fiona Owens, falling hard and fast, and there was nothing safe about that. He had sworn after Sarah's death that he would never love again, never risk that kind of pain. But the heart had a way of ignoring such vows, and his heart had already decided that Fiona was someone special. Over the following weeks, Blake made good on his promise. He visited ranches and farms throughout the area, talking up Fiona's skills as a seamstress. His reputation as an honest, hard-working man carried weight, and soon people were coming to Cimarron specifically to seek out Fiona's services. She found herself busier than she had been in months, making children's clothes, mending work shirts, creating dresses for ranch wives who rarely had the opportunity to own something new and pretty. The extra income meant she could finally eat regular meals without worry, could afford a new pair of shoes to replace her worn ones, could even save a little money for the first time since leaving St. Louis. But more than the financial security, she treasured Blake's visits. He came to town every few days, always with supplies despite her protests that she could now buy her own, always with stories about life in the mountains that fascinated her. She learned that he lived in a cabin he had built himself, overlooking a valley where elk grazed in the early mornings. He hunted and fished, grew vegetables in a carefully tended garden, and spent his winters reading books by firelight and carving wood into intricate figures. He showed her some of his carvings once, beautiful renditions of animals and birds that demonstrated an artistic talent she had not expected from such a rough, physical man. In return, Fiona shared her own dreams and fears with him. She spoke of her love for creating beautiful things with fabric and thread, her hope of one day owning her own dress shop, her fear that she would never truly be free of her father's shadow. Blake listened with patience and attention that made her feel valued and heard in ways she never had before. One evening in early October, when the air had taken on an autumn chill and the aspen trees on the mountainsides blazed gold, Blake arrived in town with an unusual request. "I was wondering if you would like to see my cabin," he said, standing awkwardly outside her door like a nervous schoolboy despite his imposing size. "It is a full day's ride, so you would need to stay overnight, but I have a spare room and I promise to be a perfect gentleman. I just thought you might like to see where I live, understand why I love those mountains so much." Fiona's heart leaped at the invitation. She had been curious about his home, about the place that called to him so strongly. But spending a night alone with him, even with separate rooms, would be scandalous if anyone found out. "I would love to," she said, making her decision quickly. She trusted Blake completely, and she was tired of always doing what was proper and expected. "When would we go?" Blake's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Tomorrow. I could pick you up at dawn. I will be ready." That night, Fiona lay awake thinking about the journey ahead. She was nervous but also excited in a way she had not felt in years. She cared for Blake deeply, had known that for weeks now, but had been afraid to examine those feelings too closely. This trip would be a test of sorts, a chance to see if what was growing between them could become something more. Blake arrived just as the sun was rising, driving a wagon pulled by two sturdy horses. Fiona climbed up beside him, a small bag with her overnight things at her feet, and they set off toward the mountains. The journey was beautiful, taking them through valleys and across streams, climbing steadily higher as the terrain grew more rugged. Blake pointed out landmarks and wildlife, his deep voice filled with obvious love for this wild country. They stopped at midday beside a creek to water the horses and eat the lunch Fiona had packed. They sat on smooth rocks by the water, and Fiona marveled at how comfortable she felt here in the wilderness with him. She had always lived in cities or towns, but there was something about the mountains that spoke to her soul, a sense of peace and freedom she had never experienced before. "It is beautiful here," she said, watching sunlight sparkle on the creek water. "Wait until you see the view from my cabin," Blake replied. "It is even better." They reached his property in the late afternoon, and Fiona gasped when the cabin came into view. It was larger than she had expected, built of sturdy logs with a covered porch and shuttered windows. But it was the location that took her breath away. The cabin sat on a rise overlooking a vast valley, with mountains rising in every direction, their peaks already dusted with early snow. The valley floor was a patchwork of gold and green, and in the distance she could see a herd of elk grazing peacefully. "Blake, this is magnificent," she breathed. He helped her down from the wagon, his large hands spanning her waist easily, and she felt the now familiar flutter in her stomach at his touch. "Come inside. I will show you around." The cabin's interior was clean and well organized, with a large main room that served as living area and kitchen, a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. Handmade furniture spoke to Blake's skill with wood, and shelves held books and his carved figures. He showed her the spare room where she would sleep, which had clearly been prepared with care. A quilt covered the bed, and wildflowers sat in a jar on the small table. "I aired it out yesterday," Blake said, looking embarrassed. It has been used for storage mostly, but I cleaned it up for you." Fiona turned to him with tears in her eyes. "You went to so much trouble. I wanted you to be comfortable." She reached up and touched his bearded cheek, and Blake froze, his breath catching. "You are the kindest man I have ever known." Blake covered her hand with his, pressing it more firmly against his face. "You make me want to be better than I am." "You are already wonderful," Fiona whispered. They stood like that for a long moment, so close that Fiona could feel the heat radiating from his powerful body. Blake's other hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling gently in her hair. He looked at her with such longing that Fiona felt her knees go weak. "Fiona," he said hoarsely, "I should not. We should not." "Why not?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Because once I start, I will not want to stop. Because I am falling in love with you, and that terrifies me. Because I lost everyone I loved once before, and I do not think I could survive it again." Fiona felt tears slip down her cheeks at his raw honesty. "I am falling in love with you too. And I am terrified as well. But I am tired of being afraid, Blake. I am tired of running from life because it might hurt. I want to feel something good, something real. I want to feel this." Blake groaned and pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her and holding her tightly. Fiona pressed her face against his broad chest, hearing his heart pound as rapidly as her own. They stood entwined in the doorway of the spare room, neither speaking, just holding each other as if they might disappear if they let go. Finally, Blake pulled back just enough to tilt her face up toward his. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," Fiona breathed. "Please, yes." Blake lowered his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, but Fiona rose on her toes to meet him halfway. Their lips touched gently at first, tentatively, learning each other. Then Blake's arms tightened around her and the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate. Fiona wound her arms around his neck, fingers threading through his long hair, and lost herself in the sensation of finally being kissed by this man she loved. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Blake rested his forehead against hers, his hands shaking slightly where they held her waist. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "So have I," Fiona said, smiling up at him. "Why did we wait so long? Fear? Stupidity? Take your pick." Fiona laughed, the sound bright and happy, and Blake felt something in him that had been frozen for 8 years finally thaw completely. He was alive again, truly alive, and it was both wonderful and terrifying. They spent the evening cooking dinner together, moving around the kitchen with surprising ease. Blake had clearly learned to be self-sufficient in his years alone, and Fiona was impressed by his competence. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. "I could stay here forever," Fiona said softly, leaning against Blake's shoulder where they sat together on a bench he had built. "Then stay," Blake said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Fiona sat up and looked at him. "What?" Blake turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Stay, move up here with me. I know it is fast, I know it is probably crazy, but Fiona, I love you. I love your kindness and your strength and your generous heart. I love how you make me feel alive again after I thought that part of me was dead forever. Stay with me." Fiona's mind raced. This was happening so quickly, too quickly by any rational standard. But her heart was screaming yes, telling her this was right, that Blake was right. "Blake, we have only known each other a few months. I know. And if you need more time, I will wait. I will wait as long as you need, but I had to tell you how I feel. I had to let you know that I want a future with you if you will have me." Fiona searched his face, seeing the vulnerability there, the fear of rejection. This strong, capable man who had survived so much loss was offering her his heart, and she knew what courage that took. "I want that too," she said quietly. "I want a future with you, but I think we should wait a little longer, make sure this is real and not just. I do not know loneliness or circumstance bringing us together." Blake nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "You are right. That is the smart, reasonable thing to do. But that does not mean I love you any less," Fiona added quickly. "I do love you, Blake, so much it scares me." Blake pulled her back against his side, kissing the top of her head. "Then we will wait. We will do this right." They sat together, watching the stars emerge one by one, and Fiona felt a contentment she had never known. This rough mountain man had shown her what real love looked like, patient and selfless, asking nothing but offering everything. She knew with absolute certainty that she would spend the rest of her life with him. But Blake was right to want to do things properly, to give them both time to be sure. That night, Fiona lay in the spare room bed, wrapped in the quilt that smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke, and thought about her future. The room was dark, but moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the rough log walls. She could hear Blake moving around in his room across the hall, and she smiled, feeling safe and cherished in a way she never had before. The next morning, Blake made breakfast while Fiona sat at his table watching him work. He moved with efficient grace despite his size, and she found herself imagining many mornings like this, the two of them together in comfortable companionship. "I do not want to go back to town," she admitted when they were eating. Blake looked up from his plate, hope flaring in his eyes. "Then stay another day or two, stay as long as you want." "What about my seamstress work? People are expecting me. Send word with me when I go down for supplies. They will understand." So Fiona stayed. One day became 3, and 3 became a week. She helped Blake with his chores, learning how he smoked meat and tended his garden and checked his traps. He taught her to fish in the creek and to identify animal tracks. At night, they sat by the fire, talking and reading aloud to each other from his collection of books. And always there was the physical awareness between them, the stolen kisses and gentle touches that spoke of growing desire alongside their deepening love. Finally, Fiona knew she had to return to town, if only to collect her things and let people know she was all right. Blake drove her down the mountain on a crisp November morning, and the town seemed too loud and crowded after the peaceful isolation of the cabin. Mrs. Chen, the boarding house owner, was relieved to see her. "Miss Owens, I was beginning to worry. Mr. Irwin said you were visiting his cabin, but a week is a long time." "I am sorry to worry you," Fiona said sincerely, "but I am fine. Actually, I am better than fine." She spent the next few days catching up on her seamstress work, fulfilling orders that had come in during her absence. Blake came to visit every evening, and they would walk through town together or sit on the boarding house steps talking. People noticed, of course, and there was gossip about the mountain man and the seamstress, but Fiona found she did not care. She was in love, and everyone could see it. 2 weeks before Christmas, Blake came to town with a purpose in his stride that Fiona recognized. He knocked on her door, and when she opened it, he dropped to one knee right there in the hallway, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Fiona Owens, I know we agreed to take our time, but I cannot wait any longer. I have been alone for 8 years, and in the few months I have known you, you have given me more joy than I thought I would ever feel again. I love you with everything I am, and I promise to spend every day of my life making sure you know how precious you are. Will you marry me?" He opened the box to reveal a ring, simple but beautiful, with a small diamond that caught the lamplight. Fiona's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she gasped. "Yes, Blake, I will marry you." Blake stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite the narrow hallway. When he set her down, he slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her deeply, pouring all his love and relief into the kiss, and Fiona kissed him back with equal passion. Mrs. Chen heard the commotion and came up the stairs, then broke into a wide smile when she saw the embracing couple. "There is going to be a wedding," she announced happily. News spread through the boarding house and then through the town. By evening, half of Cimarron knew that Blake Irwin had proposed to Fiona Owens, and she had accepted. Well-wishers stopped by to congratulate them, and Fiona was overwhelmed by the genuine happiness people showed. She had not realized how many friends she had made during her time in town. They decided to marry just after Christmas, wanting a short engagement but also wanting to celebrate properly. Fiona made her own wedding dress, a beautiful creation of cream-colored silk that she had been saving for something special. Blake cleaned and repaired the cabin obsessively, wanting everything perfect for when he brought his bride home. On December 28, 1874, they were married in the small church in Cimarron, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Blake wore a new suit that Fiona had made for him, and she wore her beautiful dress with wildflowers in her hair. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Blake kissed her so thoroughly that people cheered and whistled. The reception was held at the boarding house, with Mrs. Chen and several other women preparing a feast. There was music and dancing, and Fiona found herself passed from partner to partner, but always her eyes sought out Blake, and always he was watching her with such love that her heart felt too full to contain it. As evening fell, they said their goodbyes and climbed into Blake's wagon for the journey up to their mountain home. Snow had fallen the night before, and the landscape was transformed into a winter wonderland. Fiona snuggled against Blake's side, protected from the cold by his warmth and the thick blankets he had brought. "Are you warm enough, Mrs. Irwin?" he asked, the new name making them both smile. "I am perfect, Mr. Irwin. Absolutely perfect." They reached the cabin well after dark, and Blake carried Fiona over the threshold despite her laughing protests that she was too heavy. "You are light as a feather," he insisted. And indeed, she seemed to weigh nothing in his powerful arms. He set her down gently in front of the fireplace, where he had prepared a fire before they left. The cabin glowed with warmth and welcome, and Fiona felt her heart swell with happiness. This was her home now, their home, and she had never been more certain of anything in her life. Blake helped her remove her coat and then stood before her, suddenly looking uncertain. "Fiona, it has been a long time since I was married before, if you need time, if you want to wait." Fiona placed a finger on his lips, silencing him. "I do not want to wait. I want to be your wife in every way. I love you, Blake." He closed his eyes, clearly overcome with emotion. "I love you too, so much." Their wedding night was everything Fiona had hoped for and more. Blake was gentle and patient, mindful of her inexperience, making sure she felt loved and cherished. And afterward, as they lay tangled together in his bed, their bed, Fiona felt a completeness she had never known. She had found where she belonged, and it was here, in this mountain cabin with this incredible man who had first shown his love by making sure she had enough to give and to keep. The winter passed in blissful happiness. Fiona took to mountain life with surprising ease, learning all the skills she needed to survive and thrive in the wilderness. Blake taught her to shoot a rifle, not just for hunting but for protection when he was away checking traps. She proved to be a quick learner and a good shot, which both pleased and impressed him. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading or working on projects. Fiona sewed new curtains for the windows and quilts for the bed. Blake carved a beautiful rocking chair for her, knowing she loved to sit on the porch in good weather. They made love often, learning each other's bodies, finding joy in their physical connection. In March, Fiona realized she was pregnant. She told Blake one evening after dinner, watching nervously for his reaction. He went completely still, his face draining of color, and for a moment she feared he would be upset. Then tears filled his eyes and he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he whispered hoarsely. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Fiona asked, hearing the emotion in his voice but unable to see his face. Blake pulled back and cupped her face in his hands, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Happy does not begin to cover it. Terrified, yes. After what happened to Sarah and Emma, I am scared to death, but also happier than I have any right to be. You have given me everything, Fiona. Everything. Fiona wiped his tears away with her thumbs. We will be all right. I am strong and healthy and we will take every precaution. And if you cannot bear to stay up here while I am expecting, we can move to town temporarily, be close to the doctor. Blake considered this. Maybe for the last month or two, just to be safe, but I do not want fear to rule our lives. We will be smart and careful, but we will also trust that things will work out as they should. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Fiona felt well most of the time, though she tired more easily as the months passed. Blake was endlessly attentive, doing more than his share of the work, always making sure she had nutritious food and plenty of rest. In August, they moved down to Cimarron and took a room at the boarding house, wanting to be close to medical help when the baby came. On September 15, 1875, after a long but uncomplicated labor, Fiona gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Blake was there for the birth, holding her hand and encouraging her through the pain, and when the doctor placed their son in his arms, he wept openly. "He is perfect," Blake said in awe, staring at the tiny red face. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Fiona asked, exhausted but radiantly happy. Blake looked at his son, then at his wife, and said, "How about Henry? Henry Blake Irwin." "Henry," Fiona repeated, tasting the name. "I like it. Hello, little Henry." The baby made a small sound, and both parents laughed with delight. Blake sat on the edge of the bed, and they spent the next hour just marveling at what they had created, this perfect little person who represented their love and their future. They stayed in town for another month to make sure Fiona recovered fully, then returned to their mountain home. Henry thrived in the clean air and peaceful surroundings, growing strong and healthy. Blake was a devoted father, patient and gentle with his son, and watching him with the baby made Fiona fall in love with him all over again. One afternoon in November, Fiona was sitting on the porch in her rocking chair, nursing Henry, when she saw a small figure walking up the road toward their cabin. As the person got closer, she realized it was a child, a boy of perhaps 7 or 8, walking alone. She called for Blake, who came out wiping his hands on a rag. "We have a visitor," she said, pointing. Blake shaded his eyes and watched the boy approach. When he got close enough, Blake recognized him as the son of a family that lived in a homestead about 10 miles away. The boy looked tired and worried. "Hello there," Blake called out. "You are the Patterson boy, are you not? What are you doing so far from home?" The boy stopped at the edge of their property, looking nervous. "My ma sent me, sir. She said you were good people who might help. My pa is sick with fever and we do not have any food left. Ma wanted to come herself, but she cannot leave pa and the little ones." Fiona felt her heart squeeze with sympathy. She handed Henry to Blake and stood up. "Of course we will help, Blake. Load up the wagon with supplies." Blake was already moving toward the barn. "I will drive the boy home, make sure his family has what they need." "We will all go," Fiona said firmly. "This boy has walked a long way and probably has not eaten all day. Let me fix him something while you get the wagon ready." They spent the rest of that day and most of the next helping the Patterson family. Blake hunted fresh meat while Fiona nursed the sick father with herbal remedies she had learned to make. They left the family with enough supplies to last through the winter and made them promise to send word if they needed anything else. On the way home, with young Henry sleeping peacefully in Fiona's arms, Blake reached over and squeezed her hand. "You are still giving away everything you have to people who need it," Fiona smiled. "Not everything, but we have so much, Blake. How can we not share it?" "That is why I love you," Blake said simply. "That generous heart of yours." "You have the same heart," Fiona pointed out. "You gave me everything I needed before I even knew to ask for it. And I will keep doing that every day for the rest of our lives." The years passed in contentment and growing prosperity. Blake's reputation as an honest man and skilled hunter grew, and people began seeking him out to guide hunting parties or to provide meat for large gatherings. The extra income allowed them to improve their property, adding a barn and expanding the garden. Fiona continued her seamstress work, making clothes for families throughout the territory, often in trade for other goods they needed. Henry grew into a bright, curious boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. When he was 3, Fiona became pregnant again, and in 1878 she gave birth to twin girls they named Sarah and Emma after Blake's first wife and daughter. It was Fiona's idea, wanting to honor the family Blake had lost, and he loved her even more for that generous gesture. The twins were lively and mischievous, keeping both parents on their toes. Henry adored his little sisters and was protective of them from the start. The cabin rang with laughter and childish voices, a far cry from the lonely, silent place it had been when Blake lived there alone. In 1881, another son arrived, named Thomas after Fiona's deceased mother, whose name had been Thomasina. Thomas was a quiet, thoughtful child, content to sit and watch the world around him while his older siblings ran and played. Through it all, Blake and Fiona's love only deepened. They still made time for each other, stealing moments of intimacy between the demands of children and work. Blake still looked at Fiona like she was the most precious thing in the world, and Fiona still felt her heart skip a beat when she saw him chopping wood or coming home from a hunt. They continued their practice of helping those in need, never turning away someone who asked for assistance. Their reputation for generosity spread throughout the territory, and people knew they could count on the Irwins in times of trouble. But Blake always made sure his own family had plenty first, remembering his promise to ensure Fiona always had enough to give and to keep. One evening in the summer of 1884, when the children were asleep and Blake and Fiona sat on their porch watching the sunset as they had done countless times before, Fiona leaned her head on his shoulder and sighed contentedly. "You ever miss the solitude?" she asked. "Before I came into your life and turned everything upside down." Blake wrapped his arm around her and pulled her closer. "Not for a single second. You gave me my life back, Fiona. Reminded me what it means to be alive, to feel, to love. I was just existing before, surviving but not living. Now I have everything I ever wanted and more than I ever dreamed possible. Even with 4 children running you ragged," Blake chuckled. "Especially with 4 children running me ragged. Every sleepless night, every scraped knee, every moment of chaos is precious to me. I almost lost all of this once before. I do not take a single day for granted." Fiona turned to look at him, seeing the fine lines around his eyes and the gray threading through his dark hair. They were both getting older, but to her, he was more handsome than ever. "I love you, Blake Irwin. I loved you from the moment you left that first crate of supplies outside my door. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Thank you for making sure I had enough to give and to keep." Blake kissed her softly, tenderly. "Thank you for giving your last bread to a hungry child, for showing me what true kindness looks like, for loving me when I thought I would never love again. You are my everything, Fiona. You always will be." They sat together as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple, just as they had on that first night in Blake's cabin 10 years earlier. The mountains rose around them, eternal and unchanging, but their lives had been transformed completely. From loneliness and despair had come love and family and joy beyond measure. Inside the cabin, their children slept safely, their bellies full, their futures bright with possibility. And out on the porch, their parents held each other close, grateful for every moment that had led them to this life together. Blake had made sure Fiona always had enough, and she had given him back his purpose, his heart, his reason to live. It was a simple story in the end, this tale of a mountain man and a seamstress in the wild territories of New Mexico in the 1870s and 1880s. But it was their story, built on kindness and generosity, and a love that had healed two wounded souls. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Blake and Fiona Irwin looked out at their small piece of paradise and knew they were exactly where they belonged, together forever, with enough love to give and to keep for all their days. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Winters came with deep snows that sometimes isolated them for weeks at a time, but the family had learned to prepare well, and those snow-bound months became precious times of closeness and shared activities. Blake would carve wooden toys for the children while Fiona sewed doll clothes or new shirts. Henry learned to read from his mother and to track animals from his father. The twins, now 6 years old, were learning to cook and sew under Fiona's patient guidance. Little Thomas, at 3, followed his father everywhere, his small hand always reaching for Blake's large one. The spring of 1885 brought floods from the melting snow, and several families in the lower valleys lost their homes. Blake and Fiona opened their property to 3 families who needed temporary shelter while they rebuilt. It was crowded and chaotic, with 13 extra people sharing the cabin and barn, but Fiona organized everything with calm efficiency. Blake hunted constantly to keep everyone fed, and the children learned valuable lessons about helping others in need. One of the displaced families was the same family whose boy had come to them for help years earlier. The Pattersons had fallen on hard times again, and Mrs. Patterson cried when Blake rode up to their flooded homestead with his wagon. "I do not know what we would do without you folks," she said, gathering her crying children around her. "You saved us before, and here you are saving us again." "That is what neighbors do," Blake said firmly, loading their salvaged belongings into his wagon. "You would do the same for us." By summer, all the families had rebuilt and moved back to their own properties, but the bonds formed during those difficult months remained strong. The community in the mountains grew tighter, with families helping each other more freely, and Blake and Fiona at the center of that network of mutual support. In August, a circuit preacher came through the area, and Blake suggested they renew their vows on their 10-year anniversary. Fiona loved the idea, and on August 28, 1885, they stood before the preacher and their 4 children and promised each other forever all over again. This time, Blake's vows included gratitude for their children and for every day they had been given together. Fiona's vows spoke of how Blake had shown her what love truly meant and how she would choose him again in every lifetime. Their oldest, Henry, who was now 9, stood tall and proud beside his father, already showing signs of the strong man he would become. The twins, Sarah and Emma, wore matching dresses their mother had made, their faces serious as they watched their parents. Little Thomas held tightly to Blake's leg, not fully understanding the ceremony but sensing its importance. That night, after the children were asleep, Blake and Fiona lay in bed talking about the past 10 years. They spoke of the struggles and the joys, the fears and the triumphs, the everyday moments that had woven together to create a life neither could have imagined when they first met. "Do you remember that first time you came to the boarding house?" Fiona asked, tracing patterns on Blake's chest. "You were so nervous, standing there with your hat in your hands." "I had been alone for 8 years," Blake reminded her. "I had forgotten how to talk to people, especially beautiful women who made my heart race." "I made your heart race. From the first moment I saw you give away that bread. Something in me just knew you were going to change my life." Fiona propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "I felt the same way. When you showed up at my door that evening and told me you wanted to help, I thought you must be too good to be true. But you have proven every day since that you are exactly who you appeared to be, a good man with a generous heart." Blake pulled her down for a kiss. "I am only as good as you make me want to be." They made love slowly, tenderly, celebrating their anniversary and their enduring connection. Afterward, Fiona fell asleep in Blake's arms, and he lay awake for a while longer, watching moonlight play across her face, still hardly believing his good fortune. He had been given a second chance at love and family, and not a day went by that he did not thank whatever Providence had brought Fiona into his life. The next few years brought both challenges and blessings. In 1887, Fiona became pregnant once more, and in early 1888 she gave birth to their 5th child, another boy they named Jonathan. Blake was 40 years old now, and Fiona 32, and they agreed this would be their last child. 5 was a good number, a blessed number, and their cabin was full to bursting with life and love. Henry was now 12 and took on more adult responsibilities, helping his father with hunting and trapping. He was a serious boy, thoughtful like his mother but with his father's strength and physical capabilities. The twin girls were 10 and becoming quite skilled at sewing and cooking, often helping their mother with her seamstress work. Thomas was 6 and already showing signs of his father's talent for wood carving. And baby Jonathan was a happy, easy child who rarely cried and seemed content just to be held and loved. In 1890, tragedy struck the community when a wildfire swept through the mountains during a particularly dry summer. Blake saw the smoke from miles away and immediately organized the men in the area to fight the blaze. For 3 days, he and a dozen other men worked to create fire breaks and extinguish spot fires, barely sleeping, their faces black with soot and their hands blistered. Fiona and the other women kept the firefighters supplied with food and water, taking turns riding out to where the men were working. Fiona's heart was in her throat the entire time, terrified that Blake would be hurt or killed, but she kept her fear hidden and worked tirelessly to support the firefighting efforts. Finally, a late summer rainstorm came and helped extinguish the remaining flames. Blake came home exhausted and injured, with burns on his arms and a deep cough from the smoke, but alive. Fiona nursed him back to health over the following weeks, and Blake was grateful once again for this woman who had become his anchor and his strength. The fire had destroyed several cabins and much valuable grazing land, but miraculously, no lives were lost. The community rallied to help those who had lost their homes, and Blake and Fiona once again opened their property to displaced families. The children helped without complaint, understanding now that their family's purpose included caring for others in need. As the 1890s progressed, the West was changing rapidly. The territories were becoming states, railroads were crisscrossing the land, and civilization was encroaching on the wild places that had once seemed endless. Blake watched these changes with mixed feelings. Part of him mourned the passing of the old ways, but another part recognized that progress brought benefits too: better medical care, easier communication, more opportunities for his children. Henry, at 15, began talking about becoming a doctor. He had watched his mother care for sick and injured people throughout his childhood, and it had sparked an interest in healing. Blake and Fiona encouraged this dream, even though it would mean sending him away for education. They began setting aside money for his schooling, determined that their children would have opportunities they never had. The twins were developing distinct personalities despite their identical appearance. Sarah was quiet and bookish, loving to read and learn, while Emma was more adventurous and physical, preferring to be outside helping with the animals rather than inside with her needle and thread. Thomas, at 11, had already carved dozens of beautiful figures and was showing real artistic talent. And Jonathan, now 4, was proving to be the family comedian, always making his siblings laugh with his antics. In 1893, Fiona's father died back in St. Louis. One of her brothers sent word, including a letter from her father written just before his death. In it, he apologized for trying to force her into marriage and expressed regret that his stubbornness had cost him a relationship with his daughter. He wrote that he had followed her life from afar, hearing occasional news through mutual acquaintances, and that he was proud of the life she had built for herself. He left her a small inheritance, money that Blake and Fiona decided would go toward Henry's medical education. Reading her father's letter, Fiona cried for the relationship they never had and for the reconciliation that came too late. Blake held her while she grieved, and they talked long into the night about forgiveness and regret, and the importance of not wasting time on pride and stubbornness. "We will make sure our children know they are loved," Fiona said fiercely. "We will never let pride come between us and them." "Never," Blake agreed. "They will always know they can come to us, no matter what." In 1895, when Henry was 17, he left for medical school in Denver. The whole family made the journey to see him off, and there were many tears, especially from Fiona. Blake shook his son's hand firmly, fighting his own emotions. "You make us proud, son," Blake said, his voice rough. "Learn everything you can, then come back and help people here who need you." "I will, Pa," Henry promised. "I will make you and Ma proud." The twins were 15 now and being courted by local boys, much to Blake's dismay. He found himself sitting on the porch cleaning his rifle whenever young men came calling, and Fiona had to remind him that he could not scare away every potential suitor. "They are too young," Blake grumbled. "They are the same age I was when I came to Cimarron," Fiona pointed out. "And I was running away from home and living on my own." "That is different." "How is it different?" Blake could not articulate why it felt different when it was his daughters, but Fiona understood. She felt the same protective instinct, though she hid it better. In the end, they agreed the girls could receive callers, but any serious courtship would have to wait until they were at least 18. Thomas, at 13, announced he wanted to be an artist and moved to Santa Fe to study. Blake struggled with this more than he had with Henry's decision to become a doctor. Art seemed less practical, less secure, but Fiona reminded him that Thomas's gift was real and should be nurtured. "If he has talent, we should support him," she said. "The world needs beauty as much as it needs healing." Blake knew she was right, even if it worried him. They told Thomas they would help him pursue his dream when the time came. Jonathan, now 7, was still too young to know what he wanted to be, but he showed interest in his father's hunting and tracking skills. Blake began teaching him seriously, and the boy proved to be a natural woodsman. In 1897, Sarah announced her engagement to a young rancher named David Morrison, a good man from a solid family. The wedding was planned for the following spring. Emma, meanwhile, shocked everyone by declaring she wanted to become a teacher and had no interest in marrying anytime soon. Blake found he was relieved by this news, not ready to give up both daughters at once. Henry came home from medical school for Sarah's wedding in the spring of 1898. He was 20 now, serious and focused, already showing the dedication and compassion that would make him an excellent doctor. He had one more year of schooling, then would begin his practice. He told his parents he planned to return to the Cimarron area and serve the mountain communities where he had grown up. Sarah's wedding was a joyous occasion, with the whole community attending. Fiona made her daughter's dress, a beautiful creation of white silk and lace, and cried when she saw Sarah wearing it. Blake walked his daughter down the aisle with tears streaming down his weathered face, and when he placed her hand in David's, he whispered, "You take good care of her." "I will, sir," David promised. "I love her with all my heart." As Blake walked back to sit beside Fiona, he caught her eye and they shared a look that encompassed their entire history together. 23 years had passed since that hot August day when he first saw her give her last bread to a hungry child. They had built a beautiful life together, raised 5 remarkable children, and created a legacy of love and generosity that would continue through the generations. After the wedding, as the party continued, Blake and Fiona slipped away to sit on the porch of their cabin, just the two of them. The sun was setting over the mountains they both loved, painting the sky in brilliant colors. "We have done well," Blake said quietly, taking Fiona's hand. "We have," Fiona agreed. "I am so proud of our children. They are good people, all of them." "They learned from the best," Blake said, raising her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "They learned from you. From both of us," Fiona corrected. "You taught them strength and honor and the importance of helping others. I could not have raised them alone." Blake pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset. Inside the cabin, they could hear the sounds of their remaining children, Emma and Thomas and Jonathan, cleaning up from the wedding preparations. Their family was changing, evolving, but the core of it remained strong. In 1899, Thomas left for Santa Fe to study art, and in 1900, Henry completed his medical training and returned to establish a practice in Cimarron. He bought a house in town but spent most of his free time up at his parents' cabin, often bringing his medical supplies to treat people in the mountain communities who could not make it to town. Emma, true to her word, became a teacher, taking a position at the small school in Cimarron. She was beloved by her students, bringing the same patience and kindness her mother had shown her to her teaching. Jonathan, now 12, was Blake's constant companion, learning everything his father could teach him about surviving and thriving in the mountains. In 1902, Emma surprised everyone by falling in love with a traveling photographer named Charles Bennington, who came through Cimarron documenting the changing West. They married in a small ceremony and moved to Albuquerque, where Emma continued teaching and Charles built his photography business. That same year, Henry married a young woman named Alice Patterson, the daughter of the family that Blake and Fiona had helped so many times over the years. The match pleased everyone, joining two families that had long been connected through friendship and mutual support. Blake and Fiona were now in their 50s, their hair thoroughly gray, their bodies bearing the marks of decades of hard work and mountain living. But they were still strong, still active, still deeply in love. They had 7 grandchildren now from Sarah and Henry, with more on the way, and their cabin was often full of visiting children and grandchildren. One evening in the fall of 1903, as they sat in their usual spot on the porch, Fiona said, "I have been thinking about that first day we met. Do you remember what you said to me?" "I said a lot of things," Blake replied, smiling. "You said I reminded you that there was still kindness in this world, that I helped you remember what goodness looked like." "I meant every word." Fiona turned to look at him. "You did the same for me, you know. When you showed up with that first crate of supplies, you restored my faith in people. You taught me that not everyone has ulterior motives, that genuine kindness still exists. You saved my life in every way that matters." Blake felt emotion tighten his throat. "We saved each other." "Yes," Fiona agreed. "We did." They sat in peaceful silence, watching their youngest son Jonathan, now 15, split wood near the barn with the easy competence Blake had taught him. Their other children were scattered across New Mexico, building their own lives, but the family remained close, gathering for holidays and celebrations. "I think about all the lives we have touched," Fiona said thoughtfully. "All the people we have helped over the years. That ripples out, you know. Those people help others and it continues spreading." "Because of you," Blake said. "Because you showed me the way by giving your last bread to a hungry child. You started all of this." "No," Fiona said firmly. "You started it by making sure I had enough to give and to keep. You gave me the resources to be generous. Without you, I would have had nothing to share." Blake pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "Then we did it together. Everything we did together." The years continued to pass, bringing more changes, more grandchildren, more joy and occasional sorrow. In 1908, Thomas returned from Santa Fe with a wife and a baby daughter, announcing he was opening an art gallery in Cimarron. His paintings of mountain landscapes were gaining recognition, and he wanted to be near his family while he built his career. In 1910, Jonathan married a local girl named Margaret Chen, the granddaughter of Mrs. Chen who had owned the boarding house where Fiona once lived. It felt like everything had come full circle. Blake and Fiona were now in their 60s, slowing down but still active. Blake no longer hunted as extensively, but he still provided for his family and helped his neighbors. Fiona's hands were gnarled with arthritis, but she still sewed, though less than before. They spent more time sitting on their porch, watching their valley, remembering their long life together. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1914, all 5 of their children came home with their families. 15 grandchildren filled the cabin and surrounding property with noise and laughter. Blake and Fiona stood surrounded by the family they had created, and both felt overwhelming gratitude for the life they had been given. Henry, now a respected doctor at 36, gave a toast at the anniversary dinner. "To my parents who taught us what love looks like, who showed us that generosity is not about having much, but about giving what you can, who built a life based on kindness and compassion and raised us to carry those values forward. We love you both, and we are honored to be your children." Everyone raised their glasses, and Blake had to wipe tears from his eyes. He looked at Fiona and saw her crying too, but smiling through her tears. They had done it. They had built something lasting and good. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Blake and Fiona walked slowly down to the creek that ran through their property. It was a warm summer night and the moon was full, lighting their way. They stood by the water, holding hands, listening to the familiar sounds of their valley. "Do you have any regrets?" Fiona asked softly. Blake thought about it seriously. "I regret the years I wasted alone after Sarah and Emma died. But if I had not had those years, I might not have been in Cimarron that day to see you. So maybe everything happened as it was meant to." "I do not regret anything," Fiona said. Even the hard parts led me here to you, to our children, to this life. I would not change a single thing." Blake turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "You are still the most beautiful woman I have ever seen. Every time I look at you, I fall in love all over again. Even with my gray hair and wrinkled face. Especially with your gray hair and wrinkled face. They tell the story of the life we have lived together. Every line, every mark represents a memory, a moment, a piece of our journey. You are perfect to me." Fiona reached up to touch his bearded face. "How did I get so lucky?" I ask myself the same question every day. They kissed under the moonlight, two people who had found each other against the odds and built something beautiful together. 40 years of marriage, 52 years of life for Fiona and 68 for Blake, and still the love between them burned as bright as ever. In 1920, Blake fell ill with pneumonia. At 74, his body could not fight the infection as easily as it once had. Henry came up from town to care for him, bringing his medical expertise, but he was honest with his mother about the prognosis. "I am doing everything I can, Ma, but he is old and his body is tired. I do not know if he will recover." Fiona sat by Blake's bedside day and night, refusing to leave him. Their children took turns visiting, bringing grandchildren and even great-grandchildren to say their goodbyes, though Fiona refused to believe Blake was dying. "You are not leaving me," she told him fiercely, holding his large hand in both of hers. "We have more years left together. You are not leaving me." Blake, weak and struggling to breathe, managed a smile. "I am not ready to leave yet. Still have to make sure you have enough to give and to keep." "You have already done that 1,000 times over. You have given me everything, Blake. Everything that matters." Somehow, perhaps through sheer stubborn will or perhaps through the excellent care he received, Blake recovered. It took months, and he was never quite as strong afterward, but he survived. By spring of 1921, he was back on his feet, moving slowly but moving nonetheless. "You are too stubborn to die," Fiona said affectionately, helping him walk down to their creek. "I get that from my wife," Blake replied, squeezing her hand. They had celebrated 46 years of marriage, and they were determined to reach 50. They had 19 grandchildren now and 7 great-grandchildren, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. Their children had all inherited their parents' values of generosity and compassion, and they were passing those values on to their own children. Jonathan had taken over the mountain property and was managing it well, though his parents still lived in the original cabin. Thomas's art gallery was successful, and several of his paintings hung in important collections. Emma and Charles had moved back to Cimarron after years in Albuquerque, both semi-retired but still active in the community. Sarah's husband David had become one of the most respected ranchers in the territory, and their large family was thriving. And Henry was the most sought-after doctor in 3 counties, known for his skill and his compassion, especially toward patients who could not afford to pay. In 1924, Blake and Fiona celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. They were both frail now, Blake 78 and Fiona 72, but their minds were sharp and their love undiminished. The celebration lasted 3 days, with family and friends coming from all over New Mexico to honor them. The governor even sent a letter of congratulations, recognizing their service to their community. On the actual anniversary day, Blake and Fiona renewed their vows once more, this time in front of a gathering of over 200 people. When Blake spoke his vows, his voice was shaky but clear. "Fiona, 50 years ago today, I married the woman who saved my life. You took a broken, grieving man who had given up on living, and you gave him reason to hope again. You filled my days with joy and my heart with love. You gave me 5 wonderful children and a life beyond my wildest dreams. I thank God every day that I was in Cimarron that August afternoon in 1874, and that I saw you give your last bread to a hungry child. That moment changed everything. I love you more today than I did 50 years ago, and I will love you for whatever time we have left and beyond. There was not a dry eye in the gathering. Fiona, crying freely, spoke her own vows. Blake, you once told me that I reminded you what goodness looked like, but you taught me what love looks like. Real love, selfless and patient and enduring. You have spent 50 years making sure I had everything I needed, not just material things but emotional support, unconditional acceptance, and unwavering devotion. You are my partner, my protector, my best friend, and the love of my life. Whatever time we have left, I want to spend it exactly as we have spent the last 50 years together, side by side, loving each other and serving others. I love you eternally, Blake Irwin. After the ceremony they danced, though Blake moved carefully and Fiona had to support him occasionally. But they danced, just as they had at their original wedding, and everyone watching was moved by the depth of love still evident between them after 5 decades. That night, exhausted but happy, they lay in bed together, Blake's arm around Fiona, her head on his chest as it had been for 50 years. "We did it," Blake whispered. 50 years. "Best 50 years of my life," Fiona whispered back. "Mine too. I love you, Fiona. I love you too, Blake, always and forever." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and when Fiona woke the next morning, Blake was gone. He had died peacefully in his sleep, holding the woman he loved, in the cabin he had built, surrounded by memories of their beautiful life together. Fiona's grief was profound but not bitter. Blake had given her 50 years of love, 5 children, 19 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren. He had shown her what it meant to truly love and be loved. Yes, she missed him with an ache that never fully went away, but she was grateful beyond measure for every moment they had shared. She lived another 6 years, surrounded by her family, still sewing when her hands allowed, still telling stories about Blake to grandchildren and great-grandchildren who loved hearing about the mountain man who had seen their grandmother give her last bread to a hungry child and had made sure she always had enough to give and to keep. Fiona Owens Irwin died peacefully in her sleep in 1930, at the age of 78. She was buried next to Blake on a hillside overlooking their valley, the mountains they both loved rising in every direction. Her children made sure a proper headstone was erected, with both their names and the dates of their lives. But underneath, they added an inscription that perfectly captured their parents' legacy. They loved deeply, gave freely, and taught us all what truly matters. The cabin Blake built remained in the family for generations. Jonathan's descendants maintained it carefully, and it became a gathering place for family reunions and celebrations. The story of Blake and Fiona was passed down through the years, inspiring each new generation to embrace the values of generosity, compassion, and enduring love that their ancestors had embodied so perfectly. And in Cimarron, New Mexico, there were still families who remembered how Blake and Fiona Irwin had helped them in times of need, who told their own children and grandchildren about the mountain man and the seamstress who had built a life based on making sure everyone had enough to give and to keep, whose love story had become legend in the mountains they called home.